what I know is that they're promising, and this one they will deliver on, more than 300 billion in new debt on the backs of future generations over the next 5 years, because those are their own numbers. And that's at the very minimum, that's what they're going to be leaving on the backs of future generations. So we're not only leaving them a huge environmental debt, we're leaving them a huge economic debt. And there's no plan to get away from it.
The dust is settling on the dropping of Mark Carney's generational budget, and it's not going over like they'd hoped. In fact, the general sense is that this budget, far from lived up to the hype, isn't transformational at all, and emphasized debt and deficit above everything else. Let's take a look. Ladies and gentlemen, we start with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. This is their take on this. Budget 2025 promises investment, but that's up to business. After 18 months, Canada's business community has been left waiting a long time for a federal budget. This is from the CFIB. Struggling small businesses won't find much help in the federal budget. Small business owners were looking to the 2025 budget to provide critical cost relief and to improve Canada's tax competitiveness to jumpstart our economy. Instead, most of the budget's economic measures were re-announcements from 2024. Quote, "Today was a missed opportunity to provide meaningful tax relief to Canadian employers. The government could have taken the reins by reducing the small business corporate tax rate, freeing up millions of dollars for investment in employees, technology, and operations," end quote, said Dan Kelly, president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, or CFIB. Government finances are a mess, but the budget just slows the growth in program spending, with overall deficits above $50 billion per year, as far as the eye can see, end quote. Kelly added, quote, "Small firms have learned the hard way that today's deficits are tomorrow's taxes." This is from the Fraser Institute. Carney poised to repeat Trudeau's biggest mistakes. The government plans to spend $585.8 billion this year, an increase of $27.5 billion compared to last December's forecast. This is from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. Federal Budget 2025, a step forward on productivity, but unlocking private investment is the missing link. And that reflects what was said at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce as well. Again, from the Fraser Institute, Carney budget continues misguided Build Canada Homes approach. The Build Canada Homes budget will be $13 billion over 5 years. This is from Reuters. Canada's first budget falls short on vow to transform Canadian economy. Quote, "This isn't a generational budget," end quote, said Theo Argytis, Senior Vice President for Policy at the Business Council of Canada. Quote, "It goes in the right direction on some fronts, but I think Carney was not as ambitious as he could have been," end quote. Argytis said that there was not enough that might speed private investment at the scale necessary for significant growth. Quote, "If you're looking to transform the economy, this budget is not going to do it," end quote. Again, from the Fraser Institute, Carney budget doubles down on Trudeau-era policies. From 2014-15 to 2024-25, federal spending on quote-unquote green initiatives increased from $0.6 billion to $23 billion. And lastly, from the Fraser Institute, Carney government's quote-unquote generational investment will land squarely on the backs of younger Canadians. To pay for today's debt accumulation, governments in the future may raise taxes. Governments in the future are going to have to raise taxes because who's going to pay for this? This is the biggest problem in this budget. So what are the Chamber of Commerce talking about? Well, the issue is there's a lot of assumptions made. Like Carney keeps saying, well, we're going to see $1 trillion of private investment here. But the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and the Ontario Chamber of Commerce are both saying the same thing. Well, that's a big assumption, buddy, but you're not actually providing the incentive for businesses to do that. And that's also reflected in some of the feedback that we're seeing in these other areas. Now, these are folks that don't really care about partisanship. They care about money. And this is what they're saying. They're saying, listen, if you want private business here, this isn't going to do it. I don't know what you think this is going to do, but you're not going to have corporations and businesses outside of Canada lined up at the door to spend money here. And that's what Carney is implying. Carney even went so far to his imply, I think I'm being conservative at $1 trillion coming into Canada. Really? Well, that's really saying something. The problem is he's signed all these free trade deals with all of these countries, but doesn't seem to understand that it's actually the businesses that need to trade with these other places in order to make that happen. And just because it's free trade doesn't mean it doesn't cost them money. To ship something from Canada to the US is a lot different than sending it overseas, either the Pacific or the Atlantic. In some cases, it's going to be a lot cheaper to pay the tariffs or to have your customer pay the tariffs and send it over to the United States than to send it overseas. That's the problem. Now, the one thing that was shocking to us here is it wasn't just these folks in these business communities and think tanks that were reacting negatively to this. You were actually seeing some of the Carney cheerleaders coming out against this as well.
If you take in the aggregate what is in this budget, Stephanie, what is the message that you think the government is actually like? We know what they wanted to send. What are they actually delivering, do you think? Can you identify it?
I mean, I would say that there's a high-level takeaway for a lot of people, and it might be this. Over the last decade of Liberal government, the Canadian public has been really conditioned to believe when the government says we're going to transform your life, we're going to change your life, it means we're going to pay for your life. And in this instance, what we have is a government doing sort of the opposite of that. And they are turning to the private sector, and they're saying, your turn. We have done a lot of things over time. We are still going to spend some money, but as the Prime Minister once famously said in his days in the private sector and in the central bank, there's a lot of lazy corporate capital out there, and it's time for you guys to start spending and for us to spend less. That's interesting because it puts a lot of pressure on the corporate Canada to deliver on the promise Mr. Carney is making to Canadians. And if they don't build those new factories, change their production lines, do all of the things that he says is going to juice the Canadian economy, where does that leave him in the end?
Well, and he's attaching very specific numbers to that promise, Tom. He's saying $500 billion over 5 years in extra private capital will come into Canada. What do you think of that?
That's aspirational, as they like to say, but what I know is that they're promising, and this one they will deliver on, more than $300 billion in new debt on the backs of future generations over the next 5 years, because those are their own numbers, and that's at the very minimum. That's what they're going to be leaving on the backs of future generations. So we're not only leaving them a huge environmental debt, we're leaving them a huge economic debt, and there's no plan to get away from it. One of the problems that I see from a simple, basic political communications point of view, I watched the entry into the House of Commons by both Prime Minister Carney and Finance Minister Champagne, and they were doing the opposite of any good common sense. They were setting the bar so high. And then once he stood up, we just watched Champagne walk under that bar. He never met that bar. None of the promise of generational, transformational spending and change is there. Even the stuff about the public service is, well, we'll sort of let the baby boomers retire early and maybe we'll tap into a theoretical surplus in the pension funds to get them out faster. But there's no plan around that. You know, when Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien went after the years of deficit spending that we had, they did it seriously. Here it's just guesswork and, well, let's hope something proper comes of it. That's the problem. That, for me, is the basic flaw in this whole budget process that we've just seen. A lot of that spending's already taken place. That's not their fault. That is fair to say. But at the same time, they haven't done their part of the job, I don't think.
Even though Tom Mulcair came out in opposition to the budget, the one thing that I really have to smack him for is saying, well, you know, a lot of the stuff is already, you know, being spent. That's not their fault. Excuse me, that's not their fault. This is the same frickin' cabinet that was under Justin Trudeau. It absolutely is their fault. This is the Liberal Party. The only one who's really changed here is Mark Carney. This is the same crew. So to say it's not their fault is, I'm sorry, that's complete garbage. But the fact that Tom Mulcair, who has been fanatical in his praise of Mark Carney since last summer, has come out and said, yeah, so they're trying to say that there's going to be a $500 million or $500 billion to $1 trillion in private investment coming into Canada, and that's going to fix the economy. He's like, sure, they can promise that, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. And he says, what will happen is the bare minimum of $300 billion in extra debt right now. That's going to take us from around $1.3, $1.4 trillion to $1.6, $1.7 trillion in terms of the national debt. And he's even criticizing their handling of the cuts in the public sector. He's like, okay, so they're saying they might get around to this, but there's nothing concrete. They're like, yeah, we'll see what happens. Well, how can you say that? And this is where people are saying, yeah, this minimum of $78.3 billion deficit, that's the minimum, and it's most likely not going to be that. And you're probably going to see it closer to $90 or $100 billion in deficit. So hats off to C.D. Howe, who predicted a $92 billion deficit in the summer. So that's saying something, that Tom Mulcair was coming out against this, but we're not done.
It was billed as something generational, transformative, a sea change. Corey, did it deliver?
I don't think it was, this huge transformational budget. Like, it didn't feel like that to me. But then again, I'm not an economist. I'm a political hack. So maybe these changes are going to spur huge amounts of investment, and we'll all be shocked and surprised. I didn't find it was a terribly political budget, like in terms of the communication of it, and I don't know if you were to ask, even today or a few days from now, if anyone in Canada will have the first clue of what was in the budget and what it was all about, other than perhaps the deficit number. So I don't think it really punched through. And I think, the topic that we were just talking about, a floor crosser happening on budget day, was stepped on the budget message big time. And I wouldn't, I'm sure the Liberal caucus welcomes having another member, but I would sure not have preferred to have it on that day if I were them.
We spoke so many times in the lead up to the budget about sort of a somewhat convoluted narrative heading into it. Do you think the narrative was better defined or at all defined coming out, now that we actually have the document coming out of it, Scott?
I thought it was better defined on budget day, but there's still a big challenge. I mean, first of all, there was a hype man dimension to the pre-budget communications. It's going to be generational. This is a hinge moment. Oh my God, think about World War II type developments. So they excited people to the point where anything short of Krypton exploding was going to be a bit of a letdown. So I think that was a challenge. Then beyond that, I think when you look at this budget in terms of its actual measures, you can tell that the Prime Minister used to be a central bank governor, because when you look at it, it seeks to re-engineer, restructure the economy of Canada in response to legitimate concerns and pressures. The absence of the United States is that reliable partner that generates wealth and prosperity and jobs. So you want to restructure it. The challenge is that those measures, first of all, we don't know if they'll work. Second of all, if they do work, they take 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. And of course, the political calendar operates at a different level. So, I mean, are there people at the local bus stop saying, what, I think it's important that they had all those impressive productivity and competitiveness measures, because I believe that that's going to spur investment in machinery over the course of the next 6 years, which will generate investment and attract investment by the time that my children are graduating from high school. That's the challenge.
So to hear Corey tonight come out there and say that's something, because usually he's crapping all over the Conservatives. And to even hear Scott Reid come out and say, they hype this up, so anything short of a grand slam home run where, lightning strikes the stadium at the time that happens is going to be a complete letdown, which by all accounts, that's what happened, that it was a complete letdown. And he's saying nobody understands what's in this budget. Now, he tries to say, well, Mark Carney seeks to transform the economy. But notice what he said at the end. There's no guarantee that that's going to happen. because he's putting it on everybody else. This is the problem with Mark Carney and never running a business, because he's always just sat at the periphery and pushed some buttons and waited for everything else to happen everywhere else. He's never had to make change himself. That's the issue. And Scott Reed also says, and he makes a good point here, he's like, the way that they're trying to sell this, no one's going to understand it. And this is actually going to backfire on the Liberals. Not understanding the corruption that's going on, that's one thing. And that's a lot what has gone on over the last year or so. You ask the average Canadian what the STTC scandal is, what a Rive scam is, even what SNC Lavalin is. A lot of people have no idea what you're talking about. So that's where it's played into the hands of the Liberals. However, in this case, it's going to play against the Liberals. Why? Because, like Corey said, all Canadians are really going to take away from this is $78.3 billion in extra deficit. $300 billion in extra debt over the next few years. That's all they're going to take away from this. And that's where the Conservative machine needs to really focus on debt, twice as much as Justin Trudeau, in some cases 3 times as much as Justin Trudeau, spending 50% of the debt that Trudeau added over COVID, and we're not in a COVID era. So this is actually going to play really hard against Mark Carney and the Liberals, because they're not going to be able to sell this thing. And if you believe Corey, they actually shot themselves in the foot in their attempt to embarrass Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives with the crossing of Chris d'Entremont. So the problem is if they're trying to sell this budget to Canadians, what they did was completely shot themselves in the foot in having this extra story completely trump what happened on budget day. So Canadians were paying attention to that because that's the political drama versus the actual messaging in the budget. And all they're hearing was $80 billion, $300 billion. That's not good if you're the government trying to actually sell this budget. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the polling ends up being for this week and next week, and what kind of impact that has on the favorability or non-favorability for the Liberals, Mark Carney, and this budget.